In many real ways, there's sort of the quintessential American story where you have two self-taught, self-trained bicycle builders from Dayton, Ohio, of all places, who go on to do what some of the best funded, most intelligent, most educated minds hadn't been able to do for centuries, going back to Leonardo da Vinci all the way up through some of the Wright brothers' contemporaries. Some very well-funded people that were considered some of the brightest and most promising academic leaders and scientists, weren't able to solve the problem of powered, heavier-than-air controlled flight, but our hometown heroes in Dayton, Ohio are in fact able to do that. And I think it's a fantastic story from that standpoint. We are in the replica Wright Brothers bicycle shop at Carillon Historical Park in Dayton, Ohio. Carillon Park is an open-air museum of 65 acres, which is home to 30 historic buildings and structures. The centerpiece of the park is the Wright Brothers Aviation Center. The Wright Brothers Aviation Center is a 4-building complex which consists of a replica of their famous bicycle shop, 2 galleries filled with original Wright Brothers artifacts, and the centerpiece of the Wright Brothers Aviation Center is Wright Hall, which is a building constructed in 1950, specifically built to house the 1905 Wright Flyer III. Wilbur and Orville Wright were 2 middle-class brothers that were living in a household much like many other households in Dayton, Ohio. Very simple people of relatively limited economic means, but they were people that were looking to set out and make their mark on the world. So initially, Orville Wright starts up a printing business, something that he had been interested in since he was a young boy. And in this printing business, his older brother Wilbur will soon join him. And so the first time that Wilbur and Orville Wright are seen as a corporate entity together is with Wright and Wright job printers. However, with the totality of their printing, what they found was that it was a great deal of work for very little profit. They would spend hours setting the type and proofing the type and printing up their printed products, but at the end of the day, realizing very little take-home money, take-home pay. So they began to repair the bicycles of various neighbors and friends in their West Dayton neighborhood, and they began to realize that they could in fact set up another business. And so in 1892, they open up the Wright Cycle Exchange. So here in this recreated bicycle shop, much of what you see in terms of the items on the shelves are period furnishings or reproductions. However, the bicycles that are hanging here in our shop are vintage, time period appropriate bicycles of the type and even the same brand names that the Wright brothers were selling. The most significant piece in this showroom is the bicycle on the shelves here that is a 1901 Van Cleve brand bicycle. It was built by Wilbur and Orville Wright and purchased by a Dayton man for $30.75. They purchased that back in 1901. It is one of only 5 bicycles known to exist in the entire world that were built by Wilbur and Orville Wright, and one of only less than 200 bicycles that they ever built in their entire career. The Wright brothers' most famous career of aviation came about as a result of their earlier 2 careers. While Orville Wright, the younger brother, is ill, literally bedridden, Wilbur begins reading with great interest about the exploits of a man named Otto Lilienthal, a German glider pilot who by the mid-1890s had accumulated over 2,000 glides in Germany. Wilbur was reading some fantastic stories over their wire service for their printing career, to take stories and actually put them in their newspapers. And he would in fact read at Orville's bedside about some of these exploits. He would be reading news stories to Orville. Well, in August of 1896, Otto Lilienthal crashed and died hours later in the hospital from injuries breaking his neck from a glider crash. It's the death of Otto Lilienthal that Wilbur Wright will point to as being his own active interest in aviation problems and aeronautical problems. And so everyone always thinks about Wilbur and Orville Wright being this corporate entity, but in fact, Wilbur Wright was the one that was interested in flight before Orville. Most Americans learn history in sound bites, and the sound bite that they know about the Wright brothers is December 17th, 1903, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, as though that's when the first flight happened, and that's the end of the beginning and the end of the story. The reality is that starting in 1899, Wilbur and Orville Wright built their first aircraft, and this aircraft was a kite. It was a bi-wing kite made out of wood, wire, and fabric. So in that way, it has something in common with all of their successive aircraft. From that kite, then they realized, Wilbur in particular, wanted to go outside of the Dayton area and go somewhere where there was strong, consistent wind. So he writes the U.S. Weather Bureau and gets a list of all of the locations around the United States with strong, consistent wind. Near the top of the list, of course, was Chicago, the Windy City. But the problem with selecting that location was there would be so many prying eyes and so many people looking at these two cranks from Dayton, Ohio, these two bicycle builders that are trying to build a flying machine. And so in fact, they select Kitty Hawk, a remote town on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and a place that had strong, consistent wind. It also had privacy, and it also had soft sands for landing of the various aircraft. And so Wilbur and Orville go down there in 1900 with a full-scale glider. They'll also go down there in 1901, 1902, and then of course in 1903 with their world's first successful airplane. What's important though, I think, is that it was a step-by-step process, a multi-year process, not many years, but they learned different things each year that they were down in North Carolina, and each year that they would be back in Dayton, Ohio. We are now in the Wilbur Wright wing of the Wright Brothers Aviation Center, and we're standing in the Object Theater. This is one of the few object theaters in the country, and what we do is actually highlight original artifacts in a way that still cares for the artifacts and they don't put them at risk, but at the same time, our visitors don't have to look at them behind glass where it's just a look, don't touch type of environment. Here, you can look at the artifacts as they're woven into the story of the theater experience. Some of the artifacts that are on the stage include the family sewing machine in the Object Theater. And the family sewing machine was used by Wilbur and Orville Wright to sew the muslin, the heavy cotton muslin fabric on their wings for their various aircraft. Orville's drafting table is also on the stage here in the Object Theater. And the drafting table was modified by Orville with bicycle chains so that he could more easily adjust the various quadrants on his table. Just a few feet from the Object Theater, we have the 1902 Corona 5 camera that the Wright brothers owned. Among their many other interests and pursuits, they actually sold photographic supplies through their bicycle shop for a time. It was an interest and a hobby of theirs. But this Corona 5 camera is important because it's the camera that took one of history's most reproduced photographs of all time. The photograph of a single airplane taking off of a monorail track on the Outer Banks of North Carolina on December 17th, 1903. What's interesting is that the man that Orville asked to take the photograph had never taken a photograph before in his life. Orville set up the camera and tripod where he believed the aircraft could take off from its launch rail, and he said to this man, John T. Daniels, he said, "John, squeeze that bulb if anything interesting happens." Those were his exact words, and as we know from history, something very interesting did in fact happen when the aircraft took off into a 21-mile-per-hour headwind and went a distance of 120 feet in 12 seconds. So I'm standing in front of the 1905 Wright Flyer III, the world's first practical airplane. This was the third and final experimental airplane that the Wright brothers built, and today survives as the second oldest of their airplanes today. This airplane, which Orville Wright considered the world's first practical airplane, was constructed and flown in less than 6 years' time between the time that they built their kite and the success of this particular airplane. What's interesting to think about is that the Wright Flyer and Kitty Hawk flew 4 times, just 4 times on one very historic day. They were 4 very important flights, and they very much were the proof of concept of powered, heavier-than-air flight. But the airplane behind me, the 1905 Wright Flyer III, was capable of repeated takeoffs and landings, repeated flights of not just for a few seconds at a time, but upwards of 40 minutes by October of 1905. And this airplane could fly graceful circles, it could fly figure eights, it could bank and turn and fly very much like a modern airplane flies. but this is very much a modern airplane, capable of being controlled through 3 independent axes of flight: pitch, roll, and yaw. Much like a modern airplane is still controlled independently, the pitch, the roll, and the yaw. Wilbur and Orville Wright were so much of the type of humble Midwestern Daytonians, Midwestern work ethic, the type of people that would not seek out publicity and fame and attention. And yet it is very revealing that they were very aware of what they had done, and they wanted to protect their legacy. They wanted to protect the fact, and their bragging rights, if you will, that they in fact had done something that other people had worked hundreds of years to do. And so I think it maybe makes the Wright Brothers story even more powerful and more meaningful that they weren't seeking this out. They weren't pursuing the problem of powered flight for wealth. They weren't pursuing the problem of powered flight for fame. They weren't looking to run in famous circles with politicians and kings and governors and presidents. Those things happened, but that's not what they were seeking out. So I think that makes their story even more powerful. It makes it more relatable to everyday Americans today who might be working on a special project in their garage, or someone in Silicon Valley trying to work on the next best, greatest technology, or someone working in a medical facility or a lab somewhere trying to solve a problem of some terrible disease or another. So I think it's an inspirational story. I think it's a story that is very relevant, not just to Dayton, not just to Ohio, not just to America, but it's really a story that has meaning for people working on problems all around the globe.